I never thought I would be the kind of person who juggled two jobs just to keep someone else's dream alive. Yet there I was, standing behind the counter of a busy coffee shop at dawn, already exhausted, trying to paste on a polite smile. The scent of freshly ground beans mixed with my own anxiety, and I could feel the strain in my muscles from my earlier shift at the bookstore. I had taken on these extra hours so Martin, my fiancé, could quit his regular job and focus full-time on becoming a professional musician. He had always insisted that his big break was just around the corner. I believed him wholeheartedly because I loved him, and in love, you do crazy things without pausing to measure the cost. I'd lean over the counter, steaming milk for a latte, imagining how happy he would be once his band finally got signed. My feet ached from standing, but I told myself it would all be worth it. Sometimes I caught my reflection in the coffee machine's steel surfaces and wondered if I still looked like me. I hoped my eyes still held that spark of hope. I met Martin during a local music festival. He was the lead vocalist of a small rock band performing on a makeshift stage. I remember being captivated by the raw energy in his voice and the way he held the microphone as though it were a lifeline. When he glanced at me in the crowd, a jolt of electricity shot up my spine. That night, I introduced myself afterward, heart pounding like a scared rabbit's. He smiled and told me I had a beautiful spirit, something I never thought anyone would notice in me. We started talking, and it was as though we'd known each other for years. He told me about his dream to break through in the music industry. The road ahead sounded steep, but his eyes glittered with unwavering conviction. I admired his passion. It was magnetic, pulling me in like a strong current. I'd never felt so alive. From the very beginning, he said his biggest fear was to be stuck in a meaningless life without his guitar. That desire for more was contagious, and I found myself wanting to help him in any way possible, no matter the cost. Our courtship was a whirlwind of late-night rehearsals and hastily arranged takeout dinners. Martin worked a regular office job in the daytime to cover his basic bills, but he invested all his nights and every ounce of energy into writing songs and rehearsing with the band. Even though I had my own job at the bookstore, I never missed a chance to hear him play. I'd sit quietly in the corner of their rehearsal space, enthralled by every chord progression and bit of banter. It felt special to be allowed inside his creative process, where he wrestled with lyrics that sometimes came out raw and emotional. It gave me hope to see that he had something he truly believed in, something he wouldn't let the world take away. We'd often stay up until the early morning hours, discussing not only music but also our dreams, our fears, and everything else that made us feel alive. Every sleepless night spent by his side felt like a secret adventure. He talked about leaving his mundane job someday to focus entirely on his craft, and I backed him up wholeheartedly. I was prepared to do anything to watch his dream come true. About a year into our relationship, Martin decided to take that leap of faith. He announced, with eyes brimming with confidence, that he would quit his job to dedicate himself entirely to music. He had saved up a little money, but not nearly enough to cover daily expenses and band costs. He looked at me as though I was the final puzzle piece. I didn't hesitate. I told him I would pick up a few more shifts at the bookstore and maybe look for a side gig. It seemed like a small sacrifice compared to the shining future I imagined for us. I pictured a life where his band soared to fame, and I could beam with pride in the audience, remembering the nights I had supported him when nobody else would. My parents, however, were concerned and thought we were being impulsive. I waved off their worries, believing wholeheartedly that true love and genuine talent would prevail. Perhaps I was naive, or maybe just blinded by how much I cared for him. At the time, I thought my commitment to Martin's success was the grandest expression of love I could offer, and I gave it freely. Those first few weeks after Martin quit his office job felt almost celebratory. He stayed up late working on new songs, and I watched him from the kitchen table, flipping through books to keep myself awake after long shifts. Every so often, he'd run over and read me a line of lyrics he was proud of, eyes glowing like embers in a campfire. I'd squeal in excitement and praise his creativity, feeling a rush of second-hand euphoria. In a way, I enjoyed being the unsung hero. My 2 jobs brought in enough money to cover our modest rent and groceries, allowing him to pour his entire soul into the music. Yet, as the weeks passed, the exhaustion began to creep under my skin like a lingering chill. Handling the bookstore in the mornings and the coffee shop at night drained my energy and left little room for personal time. Despite my fatigue, I never complained. On the rare occasions we'd go out together, Martin was the star of the conversation. People asked him about his music, told him how brave he was, and looked at me like I was just part of his entourage. I didn't mind, at least not then. Everything changed when the band landed a small gig at a well-known local venue. It wasn't a major breakthrough, but it felt like the stepping stone we'd been praying for. Martin was ecstatic, talking about potential record label scouts who might show up. The rest of the band was equally hopeful, practicing relentlessly every day. I could see new vigor in Martin's posture, the tension in his shoulders replaced by excitement. To support him even more, I asked my boss at the coffee shop for additional hours, wanting to cushion our finances. Somehow, the 24 hours in a day never felt enough. My alarm rang before dawn, and I returned home well after midnight, barely finding time to wash my apron and uniform. But the nights Martin performed, I never missed a show. I stood in the front row, inhaling the swirling lights and pounding drum beats, feeling the thrill of possibility. His stage presence was mesmerizing, and everyone in the crowd felt it too. I was so proud that tears sometimes filled my eyes. Watching him in his element made all my hardships worthwhile. We both believed this was just the beginning of a beautiful, shared dream. After a string of small performances, Martin and his band got an invitation to record a demo. This was huge for them. They began to talk about launching a crowdfunding campaign to finance proper studio time. Martin came to me, excited about the possibilities, explaining how this was the moment he'd been waiting for. He said the demo would be their gateway to bigger stages and better-paying gigs. But there were costs not covered by crowdfunding: travel expenses, marketing, and new instruments to achieve a professional sound. Without blinking, I offered to cover whatever the campaign didn't. On paper, it didn't make sense. My savings were meager, especially after paying the bills, and my credit card debt was beginning to loom. Yet love can be illogical, driving us to act in ways we'd never foresee. He brushed a tender kiss on my forehead, calling me an angel, promising that once he made it, I would never have to worry about money again. The way he said it, with so much certainty, made me believe my sacrifices would soon pay off. I kept my doubts quiet, trusting in the future he painted with such vivid colors. Around this time, I started noticing subtle shifts in Martin's behavior. He seemed more distant, locked away with his thoughts. Sometimes he would emerge from the makeshift studio, toss me a weary glance, and mumble about needing space to think. Initially, I assumed it was stress from the upcoming demo and the pressure to prove himself. Everyone handles anxiety differently, I reasoned, so I tried not to let it worry me. But there were moments when I caught him staring at his phone with a sly smile, the kind he used to reserve just for me. When I asked, he'd quickly shove it in his pocket, muttering something about a manager or a new band contact. It stung, but I shrugged it off. I had no reason to suspect anything sinister. Our life was chaotic enough without me piling on insecurities. Besides, he'd always been passionate and sometimes moody, especially when knee-deep in a creative project. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. I convinced myself that all the extra hours and financial strain were making me imagine trouble. If I were patient, if I kept believing, everything would revert to how it used to be. Eventually, my exhaustion began to show in more obvious ways. One morning at the bookstore, I dropped an entire tray of coffee cups meant for a promotional event. The shattering glass echoed in the silent shop, drawing looks of sympathy from my coworkers. My manager pulled me aside and asked if I needed a break or possibly fewer hours. But that was never an option in my mind. Every dollar mattered now, not just for Martin's dream, but also to keep a roof over our heads. I insisted I was fine, even though my cracked voice betrayed my fatigue. Going back home that evening, I sank onto the couch, feeling the tears burning behind my eyes. Martin didn't notice because he was in the bedroom, scrolling through social media posts about the band's upcoming shows. When he finally came out, he looked restless and said, "I'm heading out for a bit." He didn't say where. I mustered the strength to nod, and then he disappeared into the night. I sat there alone, rethinking every step that had led me here. Yet, I still clung to the hope that tomorrow would be different, that it would all make sense again. When Martin returned, hours later, he was buzzing with excitement, talking about a new opportunity to collaborate with a more established musician in the city. He said he needed to attend parties and social events to network, to get his band's name out there. A small part of me was hurt he hadn't invited me, but I suppressed that feeling. If these gatherings were crucial to his success, I didn't want to hold him back. Over time, though, these networking nights grew more frequent. He'd get ready in front of the mirror, styling his hair in a way I'd never seen before, choosing outfits carefully. It wasn't the usual Martin who threw on jeans and a faded band tee. This Martin smelled of expensive cologne and wore tailored shirts I never even knew he owned. Once, he came back with a smudge of lipstick on his collar that wasn't mine. My stomach twisted in knots, but he just shrugged it off, saying someone at the party must have leaned in to talk. I tried to laugh it away, telling myself all public events can get chaotic. Yet the nagging doubt began to grow, like a quiet, persistent storm. Rumors started reaching me through mutual acquaintances. A friend of a friend hinted that Martin was seen cozying up to someone else after a show. I refused to believe it at first, accusing the rumor-mongers of jealousy or misunderstanding. But as the sightings piled up, I found myself battling an inner turmoil. My mind replayed all the suspicious moments, the hushed phone calls, the lipstick smudge, the late nights where he never actually explained where he'd been. I was terrified to confront him directly, afraid of the answer I might receive. There was so much at stake: our future, our investment in his dream, the countless hours I had spent keeping us afloat. If everything turned out to be a lie, how would I even begin to pick up the pieces? Yet the uncertainty gnawed at me, making it almost impossible to concentrate at work. Customers at the bookstore would ask for a recommendation, and I'd stand there, blank-faced, struggling to recall titles I once loved. My heart pounded with dread, and sleep became a distant memory. Part of me feared that if I accused Martin of betrayal, I'd lose him. The other part worried I already had. I decided to gather the courage and confront him one evening after he'd spent the day in the studio. I waited at the apartment, pacing the living room, practicing what I might say. By the time he walked in, my palms were damp with sweat, and my heart felt like it would bust through my chest. He plopped down on the couch, exhausted, and I could almost see the tension in his shoulders. As gently as I could, I asked about the rumors and his late nights out. He tensed up, his eyes narrowing in annoyance. He said something about people spreading lies because they envied his rising success. When I pressed for more details, he snapped. Suddenly, I was the villain, the untrusting partner who couldn't handle the pressures of his career. I felt my heart sink as he tossed back accusations. I was never around because I was always working. I didn't understand the stress he was under. I made him feel suffocated with my questions. I stared at him, momentarily speechless, because everything he said felt like a carefully crafted deflection. That night, we ended up in a stalemate, both of us too hurt to talk. In the days that followed, we drifted even further apart. Martin left early and came home late, barely offering me more than a curt nod or a mumbled greeting. Yet, I couldn't afford to reduce my working hours, especially since his new gigs weren't bringing in consistent income. My daily schedule felt suffocating. Bookstore by day, coffee shop by night, and a few restless hours of sleep in between. Whenever I looked in the mirror, my cheeks appeared sunken and my eyes dull. The stress was wearing me down from every angle. Meanwhile, I heard from a coworker that Martin's band was doing better, getting more exposure and even meeting some label representatives. Instead of celebrating this news together, I felt a bitter pang. Why wasn't he sharing these triumphs with me directly? Why was I learning about his life through others? At this point, I felt more like a stranger than his fiancé. My imagination spiraled into worst-case scenarios, picturing him with another person, living a life that didn't include me. Yet, a stubborn kernel of hope remained, insisting that maybe this was just a rough patch. Maybe it would pass like a bad storm, leaving us intact. A breaking point arrived when I came home one night to find Martin packing a small suitcase. My heart slammed against my ribcage as I asked what was happening. He didn't look at me at first. Instead, he fiddled with the zipper on the bag, then finally said he needed some time away to focus on his music. He'd been offered a spot in a workshop led by an established producer and needed to be out of state for a few weeks. He acted like this was a normal, everyday decision. When I asked why he hadn't told me sooner, he shrugged, explaining that I was always too busy or too tired to listen. The reality sank in like a lead weight. He was leaving, and I felt powerless to stop him. My mind raced. Did this workshop even exist? Or was it just another cover story? Yet, in the moment, all I could do was nod, choking back tears. He gave me a quick hug, and I stood frozen as he walked out the door. I heard the taxi drive away, and I wondered if he'd ever come back the same. A hollow sense of dread seeped into my bones. While Martin was gone, I tried to keep my life from unraveling further. Each day blurred into the next, a repetitive cycle of alarm rings, long hours standing on my feet, and nighttime commutes home to an empty apartment. The rooms felt eerily quiet without his guitar strums or the constant hum of his music equipment. I tried texting him a couple of times, but his responses were curt, filled with excuses about being busy. He never called. I told myself he was working hard, and that I should be proud of him. Still, the lack of any warmth or reassurance was deafening. At the bookstore, I found myself shelving romance novels and avoiding eye contact with covers that depicted couples in love. It felt too painful to see those glossy, smiling faces. In rare moments of respite, I reread old text messages from him. From the days when we clung to each other's every word. I tried to convince myself that I hadn't been foolish to invest so much in him. Maybe we just needed space. But that space felt endless, like a dark tunnel with no visible way out. I had never felt so alone. Days turned into weeks without much news. Then, out of the blue, Martin sent me a message stating he was extending his stay for a new project that popped up. He claimed this was a crucial opportunity that might finally land the band a record deal. Despite my reservations, I told him I understood. I even congratulated him, hoping he would sense my support and at least express some gratitude. Instead, his response was a brief, "Thanks. Let's talk soon." I spent that night staring at the ceiling, questioning how much longer I could keep going like this. My shoulders were permanently knotted from stress, and even my managers were urging me to take some time off. Financially, though, that wasn't an option. Our bank account was inching close to red every month, and I had no idea if Martin was contributing anything at all anymore. Every time I paid rent, I felt a stab of resentment, but I quickly buried it, reminding myself that love sometimes demands patience. My friends tried to get me out, telling me to remember my own dreams, my own life outside of him. But I couldn't focus on anything except the longing for his return. Then came the day I dreaded. Martin finally called, but not to say he was coming back. His voice was distant, as though it were carried on a brittle wind. He told me he needed to move on to the next phase of his career and life. My stomach dropped. I wanted to scream that I had been part of this dream from the start, that I'd shouldered the burden so he could stand on that stage. But the words didn't come out. Instead, tears silently spilled down my cheeks as he explained that he found someone who understands him better, someone who just fits. Every syllable felt like a knife. He avoided saying the word breakup, but the implication was clear. My fiancé was leaving me, and my entire world spun out of control. I thought of the 2 jobs I worked, the nights without sleep, the debt I carried for his projects. My voice trembled when I finally asked, "But what about us?" He hesitated, then muttered something about how he hoped I'd find my path too. As he hung up, the hollow sound of the dial tone felt like the final death knell of our relationship. I can't remember how long I stayed on the floor after that call. The phone screen eventually dimmed and went dark, mirroring how I felt inside. In the following days, I existed in a fog of disbelief. I'd shuffle to work, plaster on a polite smile for the customers, and then return home to an apartment full of memories I could barely face. People asked about Martin, and I forced a shaky laugh, evading the topic as best I could. Telling them he'd left felt like admitting the entire foundation I'd built my life upon was a sham. My parents tried to reach out once they found out through the grapevine. But I couldn't handle the inevitable, "I told you so," even if they'd never actually say it. So I shut them out too, retreating into myself. Lonely nights became normal. I'd stare at the emptiness of the living room, noticing the spaces where his guitar stand and amplifier used to be. When I saw the faint indentations on the carpet, my chest tightened. Every corner of the apartment was a painful reminder of a future that would never come to be. It was in that emotional wasteland that I started to see the faint glimmer of my own resilience. One afternoon, as I shelved new arrivals at the bookstore, I found a self-help book about rebuilding one's life after betrayal. It felt like fate, so I snuck it to the break room and devoured every page. The words were simple but comforting, like a steady hand reaching out to guide me. Little by little, I realized that my life didn't have to remain defined by Martin's departure. Yes, I had sacrificed so much time, money, energy, but maybe I could take those lessons and build something new for myself. One passage in particular said, "Sometimes the universe breaks you to rebuild you." I clung to that line, reading it repeatedly until it imprinted on my heart. Tears flowed freely, but they weren't just from sadness. They carried a subtle hint of hope. After work, I went home, made myself a modest dinner, and actually savored it for once. I realized that for the first time in months, my stomach wasn't in a knot. Perhaps I could find meaning in this ordeal, rediscover who I was without him. Over the next few weeks, I began to methodically disentangle my finances from Martin's. I canceled any lingering payments on band-related subscriptions, unsubscribed from newsletters, and even sold off some music equipment he'd left behind. Part of me felt guilty, but then I reminded myself I'd paid for most of it, so it was rightfully mine to dispose of. I used the small amount of cash from those sales to chip away at my credit card debt. It was a symbolic act, a step toward freeing myself from the chains of our past. Work remained tough, but I noticed a slight change in how I felt at the end of each shift. I was tired, yes, but my exhaustion was now solely for my survival, not someone else's ambition. I started to smile more at customers, even chat with them about their favorite books, remembering the joy I once found in reading. On a whim, I borrowed a few novels I'd always been too busy to touch. Curling up on the couch with a blanket and a good story felt foreign, yet comforting. I realized that I was slowly reclaiming the life I had nearly lost in the pursuit of Martin's dreams. One evening, out of nowhere, my phone buzzed with a message from Martin. My heart skipped a beat as I read, "Hey, how have you been? Can we talk?" My immediate reaction was a swirl of anger, longing, and confusion. After all he had put me through, part of me wanted to ignore him. But the other part, the part that remembered our initial connection and how deeply I once loved him, hesitated. Finally, I decided to reply with a cautious, "I'm okay. What do you need?" His responses came in a flurry of texts, a disjointed explanation that his new relationship wasn't working out as he'd hoped, that he felt misunderstood, and that he missed the sense of home we once shared. A tiny part of me felt vindicated, but that was overshadowed by the lingering pain. Did he think I was just an option to pick up again, now that his new fling fizzled out? Despite my swirling emotions, I agreed to meet in a public place the next day. I wasn't sure if I wanted closure or if I just wanted to see him one last time to confirm that I was truly done. The night passed in a restless blur. When I arrived at the cafe, I spotted Martin at a corner table, fiddling with his phone. He looked thinner, a bit worn around the edges, but my heart didn't do the familiar flip-flop it used to. Taking a deep breath, I approached him. He stood up awkwardly, then motioned for me to sit. The tension between us was thick, like an invisible wall we both felt but struggled to address. As soon as I settled, he launched into a spiel about how the music scene was cutthroat, how people he thought were friends turned out to be opportunists, and how he realized I was the only person who had truly been there for him. I listened quietly, my emotions churning. Once, I might have melted at the first sign of remorse. But I had changed. I calmly asked him about the other woman, and he looked away, muttering something about it being a mistake. My cheeks flushed with old hurt. By the time he asked if we could start over, I felt an odd sense of clarity. I told him I'd supported him with everything I had, and I had nothing left for him. His eyes darted, searching for a lifeline. None was offered. Leaving that cafe felt like walking out of a mausoleum where I'd laid to rest a giant part of my life. As I stepped into the sunlight, I inhaled the fresh air, tasting freedom and heartbreak all at once. Over the next few days, Martin tried reaching out again, apologizing and promising he would change. He even admitted he'd never fully appreciated my sacrifices, but I knew his pattern of empty promises. He thrived on big dreams and heartfelt words, yet his actions consistently fell short. So for the first time in my life, I set firm boundaries. I told him to stop contacting me and to respect my decision. It was simultaneously terrifying and empowering. In the past, my world revolved around keeping him happy and helping him succeed. Now I was placing my own well-being at the center. My nightmares about him leaving no longer haunted me. Instead, I slept more soundly, dreaming of new possibilities that belonged solely to me. I wasn't magically cured of all the pain, but I could feel a sense of self-worth stirring, reminding me that I deserved better than being someone's backup plan. This time, I listened to that voice. As the weeks wore on, I decided to quit my second job. The financial strain had eased slightly with Martin gone, and I realized I could manage with just one position if I budgeted carefully. I wanted to reclaim some time for myself. My last day at the coffee shop was bittersweet. Despite the wear and tear on my spirit, I had grown fond of some coworkers who always offered a smile or a listening ear. Nevertheless, handing in that apron felt like letting go of a burden I should never have carried alone. With fewer work hours, my evenings opened up like blank pages waiting to be filled. I visited old friends I hadn't seen in ages, found solace in their laughter, and let myself dream about going back to school or taking up a new hobby. Slowly, the feeling of being trapped faded, replaced by a cautious sense of optimism. I still had moments where memories of Martin tugged at my heart, but I countered them with reminders of how far I had come. I had survived his absence, and in doing so, I discovered a reservoir of strength I never knew existed. In time, I found my own rhythm, one not defined by another person's ambition. I learned to enjoy quiet mornings with a cup of tea and an engaging book, free from the rush that once consumed my life. I even started a journal to record my daily thoughts, fears, hopes, small victories. Each entry was a testament to growth, a reminder that betrayal could be a catalyst for something better. When I finally closed the door on the apartment we once shared, I felt only a slight pinch of nostalgia. I had chosen a smaller place on the other side of town, a place untainted by old memories. On the day I moved in, I lit a single candle, letting the soft glow dance on the walls. I thanked the universe for giving me the courage to walk away from a one-sided dream and to embrace my own future. Standing there, in the hush of my new living room, I felt tears fall. This time out of gratitude for who I had become. Though Martin's chapter in my life had ended, mine was just beginning. I was free, and I had finally stepped into the light of my own possibilities.